8 Simple Rules for Loving a Vampire by Simplified Emotions. Rule number 6. Vampires named Draco Malfoy don't want any help. She won. She'd actually won the case. There was only one stab for all creatures, but she'd done it. Most importantly, Draco could have a wand again. She almost jumped for joy right there, and it wasn't much chambers, but stilled herself remaining professional, even though her magic was buzzing beneath her skin, and adjusted the scarf she was wearing so no one would see the several bite marks she was sporting. Draco told her she could heal their bite marks if she didn't want to show them, although it looked physically painful for him to say it, but she reminded him that she liked the way his marks looked on her. She blushed when she remembered the way he had pinned her against the wall after that, whispering sweet promises of all the ways he would mark her as his. The press followed her aside as she spoke to a family of vampires that were thanking her profusely, and she turned, allowing the photographer to take a photo of her as she beamed. She let them interview her for all of 3 questions before she stated once again the importance of fighting for creature rights and how she would continue to do so as long as there were people to fight for. She rushed back to her office, waving thanks for the congratulations from her office mates, and spelled it shut. She sunk to her bum, looked up at the ceiling, and exhaled an excited breath. She'd really done it. She couldn't help the smile that overtook her, and found herself unable to stop as she got up and walked to her desk, pulling out a pen and parchment. She sent an owl to inform Draco that she couldn't meet at the new bookstore in the Muggle world they wanted to check out, and that she wanted to surprise him with something instead. She left work early that day and flew to the manor. She was almost surprised by the natural sunshine filtering through the window. Almost every time she had come at the end of her workday, it was in the dark. The front door opened and Draco stepped out. She smiled brightly. "Hello, you," she said, walking towards him. "Stop," he said, voice ice cold. She did, confused. What? She looked up at him and at the prophet he was holding in his hand. "The paper is already out." "That couldn't be possible." "Not yet," he said. "This is an old one." He held the paper up for her to see. The words Hermione Granger to bring legislation in front of the Wizengamot to overturn the wand ban on vampires was listed at the very front. She sighed with relief. "Oh, then I do get to, sir." "So, did you succeed then in your worthless legislation?" His face was devoid of all emotion, and it somehow hurt her more, then sharp pain through her, than his words did. "I didn't ask you to do this." He looked pale with fury. Hermione's skin prickled with irritation. "I know you didn't. I wanted to," she argued. "Why?" "Why? Because it's not fair that you don't have a wand. Because I see the way your face falls in those moments when you still reach for it and realize you don't have one, and then ask me to help you." "Granger? And it's not just because of you, you selfish asshole," she shouted. "Me fighting for creature right isn't something new. Why do you think I stay at my job? Because I like to sit at a desk and peer over your papers that make a bollock's worth of change?" "Well, you must have been so happy to finally get your wish. Leader of Spoo and all other activists no one cares about until they get affected by it themselves." He bit, his tone enraged. Hermione felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to cry. "You are being intentionally cruel. Tell me what's wrong instead of acting so nasty," she said. We can't do this anymore." Her face fell. I don't understand." "I didn't ask you to fight for me," he said, voice shaking. "You were hurt because of me. You were almost killed because of your foolish righteousness to protect and help." She scoffed. "It wasn't just for you, Draco." "Yes, it was. You never asked me if I wanted help. You just did it because you feel like you need to save everyone." She clenched her jaw. "I am perfectly willing to help people. It isn't dependent on just one person." "Yes, until it drives you down into the ground and you can't pull yourself out. This may have been for me, but why don't you just admit that the reason you do things for others is that it makes you feel like they'll want you then? Hermione felt like she was struck in the chest. That's not true, she burst out. Oh, yeah? He stalked towards her, and she felt a cold nothing of him as he stopped in front of her. Why don't you admit it, Granger? You fight for those who have fewer rights than others, or are looked down upon because you've always felt the same way, ever since you came into the visiting world. He shot at her. I don't. Just admit it. This project was nothing more for you than to prove to people that you're some holier than thou. Hermione slapped him. The sound reverberated as his face turned from the blur. She couldn't help it. Tears were openly streaming down her face as she looked at him. Draco's expression flickered before he returned to that cold placidity. Let me make myself clear. I am not like you, or Potter, or any of your Gryffindor friends with all your refined righteousness. I'm a coward, and I always will be. This, he gestured between them, this is the difference between you and me. Several seconds passed as they stared each other down. I'm leaving, she said as she turned away. We can talk about this tomorrow when you're done being so stubborn. He did not stop her as she pushed past him and stepped through the flue. The next day, Hermione paced in front of her fireplace. She didn't want to be the first to apologize, but both of them had a heated argument and needed to reconcile like adults. She was still extremely peeved with him and was going to demand an apology, but she wasn't going to continue stewing in her flat when he didn't even know where she lived. She threw the flue powder in the fireplace and spoke Malfoy manner. The flue spit her out. Stupid, childish vampire. Hermione sat with a snarl. He operated outside the manor gates and stomped to the front door. He pulled on the metal knocker and slammed it indelicately against the front door. After several banging attempts, it was finally heaved open by Wimley, who was looking at Hermione with a very expression. Hello, Wimley, Hermione said as calmly as she could. Where's Draco?
Miss, Wimley does not know where Master Draco is,
the elf said in a wobbly voice. No. Hermione felt her heart drop to her stomach. She pushed the door open and walked inside. What? She braced herself. What do you mean you don't know?
Master Malfoy left a note that he was going away and that he did not know if he was going to return here.
Wimley looked at Hermione.
There was nothing else,
the tiny elf said. Hermione started walking farther inside, and Wimley didn't stop her. She felt her steps falter for a moment before she kept going. She walked down the corridor to the library. The only light was the barely lit sconce. Everything was cast in shadow. Hermione felt a sad sort of nostalgia blanketed in a melancholy she did not want to relive. She arrived in front of the usually open library doors, found herself staring at the dark wood for several seconds, her breath becoming shorter. She raised her shaky hand to the bronze door handle, taking a fortifying breath before she opened the door. He wasn't. He couldn't. Down the rabbit hole, she thought as she looked into the never-ending abyss. She lit the sconces by herself with her wand, but no peak of blonde hair greeted her, no looming shadow, no toothy grin. She felt cold. Like a shadow, smoke, silent footsteps. She had not gotten used to the quiet that Draco Malfoy became, but Hermione felt the heavy thudding of her heart as she looked around for any remnants of him anyway. She looked by the fireplace. Nothing more than ash, and to the side table, a discarded book lying atop. Sisyphus. Rolling a rock up a hill for eternity as punishment for his cowardice. On top of the book was a well-used MP3 player. Hermione let only 2 tears slide down her cheek, meeting at her chin before they spattered onto the cover, before she set the book down and walked away. Out of the library, the manor, the gates. Looked back only once at the expanse of the large manor. dark looming, as cold as it had been that day, all those months ago when she had first come. Nothing. Nothing had changed since then. She hadn't changed anything but for the erratic beats of her heart, pumping in earnest despite its breakage, regardless of its unraveling. Weeks passed, and she heard nothing from or about him. No owls, no news headlines, except the one at the beginning which claimed the disappearing of turned vampire Draco Malfoy. Hermione didn't grieve him. She would be fine. It rained a lot of days, so much so that rain clouds travelled inside her flat. She felt water droplets streaming down her face. Hermione looked at the rising sun outside the window to her flat. She thought, with something she could only describe as devastation, that maybe the two of them only worked in the dark. To be continued. Thank you for listening to this chapter of 8 Simple Rules for Loving a Vampire. If you'd like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, or AO3.